Hey folks, Larson Halleck here. Let's talk about America. On occasion, I feel the need to defend American history and culture from the constant criticisms and mockeries and deconstructions it faces from the woke people. However, I'm quite willing to criticize America should it need to be criticized, and this is one of those times. Well, there certainly has been a lot of crappiness to come out of American culture, hasn't there been? And no, it's not because of slavery and colonialism. Considering the sheer ubiquity of those things, as I've discussed, I don't think it's fair to say that those are the causes of American crappiness. Taking 4 times the amount of slaves the American colonies did certainly hasn't stopped France from being the vanguard of European culture. Instead, I would like to posit that everything that the cultured people mock about America, its puritanical arts and entertainment, its sexual clodishness, its past buffoonery like prohibition, and its current fixation on social justice and deconstructionism, to be the fault of not men, but a very small subset of women. The overwhelming majority of American women have nothing to do with this, but rather it is a small, extremely vocal minority of American women that are the cause of this. The busybody schoolmarms of America, both literal and self-appointed ones. When you really study the culture and arts and entertainment of America, you'll notice a repeated trend. Not everything, but a good amount of what sucks about American culture comes from this small minority of busybody type A women. If you don't believe me, let's take a look. Let us begin with the most literal example of this phenomenon, prohibition. It is largely forgotten today, but prohibition and the women's suffrage movement went hand in hand. The temperance movement was always largely female, and it had great overlap with these suffragettes. Now, I will admit this is not because women wanted to stifle masculinity. They had some legitimate reasons for it. Women wanted control over their legal assets in addition to the right to vote because women's property was in the hands of their husbands or fathers or whatever. Some of whom were, of course, alcoholics that would literally drink away the woman's life savings. Now, that's an understandable motive to be sure. But as we all know, prohibition wildly failed. It increased crime and social decay, and it was ultimately revoked in 1933, just in time for marijuana to be banned in 1937, once again spearheaded by concerns of women being harmed by rampaging substance abusers, while working alongside paper kingpins like William Randolph Hearst, which showed that they learned absolutely nothing. Incidentally, some would argue that the more militant brands of feminism and big business have always been in a very tight alliance, but that would just be a conspiracy theory. Wink. Now let's look at the arts. Most infamously, we have something like the Hays Code, which created long-standing stereotypes of banal, insipid American films by mandating moral standards and forcing happy endings. Stereotypes that unfortunately still exist to this day. Now, the Hays Code was the brainchild of Presbyterian minister Joseph Hays. So some of you would probably be arguing, how is this the schoolmarm's fault? Now, obviously, yes, Joseph Hays was a man, but Christianity, in particular Protestantism, has always had a crisis of masculinity. Men are far less likely to be devoted worshippers than women, and priests were always seen as effeminate mollycoddle types that are not in touch with the real, red-blooded average man. This is how priests are seen today, and it was how they were seen 100 years ago. The muscular Christianity movement arose in response to this, and it did have a good amount of success from the 1860s until the 1920s. However, by the 1930s, the movement was sort of petering out, and women were once again being the predominant worshippers in mainline American Christianity. So, while Joseph Hays was a man, I think it's at least possible that he could have been influenced by, some women in his congregation. At the very least, I don't think Joseph Hays represents what the average masculine American man of the 1930s wanted. You know what else has a reputation for sucking good and hard? American literature. At the very least, the literature in the last 20 years or so. American literature was very esteemed from the period immediately following World War I up to about the 1980s. And wouldn't you know who does the most reading nowadays and has the entire publishing industry catering to them? Again, this is not entirely their fault. Publishing is a business, and a business must cater to whoever buys. But, as you will remember from my anthropology videos, I have observed how publishing companies actively shut out dissenting voices and how this bleeds into the rise of politically correct culture. And yet again, I must reiterate, this is not slamming women as a nebulous group, but rather just the uptight, anal-retentive schoolmarm sort of woman. On the subject of politically correct culture, you don't need me to tell you that workplaces and schools are miserable places, far beyond how much they need to be by the mere virtue of being places nobody wants to go. The causes of this misery have been discussed many times, but now I would have to ask you, who are the guidance counselors in schools imposing zero-tolerance policies that punish the victim of bullying as much as the bully? Who runs HR departments, stifling any camaraderie between the worker drones that would alleviate some of the drudgery? Workplace culture is itself stifled due to the fear of enraging some humorless biddy. There's a reason why men and women turned in to watch Mad Men in droves, and it wasn't a tisk-tisk at the bad old days. It was more like the old two-finger fillet to Don Draper. Now, some might question the idea of the allegedly, big bad patriarchal America being the birthplace of all this politically correct pain in the assery. I would point out to you that many people overseas have this stereotype of American women as being loud and bossy and domineering, ruling over their miserable husbands, keeping them from igniting that thumotic spark, is extremely widespread around the world and has been for decades. And of course, we can't forget that fabled American incompetent sexuality, from banning prostitution to creating modern feminism to actually being sexy in the most bumble-fucking incompetent fashion when they get around to attempting erotica. American women have a good amount to answer for in this field, or more accurately, that same tiny minority that makes the rest look bad. Now, don't think that all of this is just a crank talking. James Thurber knew it when he described his The New Yorker magazine as being not for the old lady in Dubbock, and Rudyard Kipling also knew it. As somebody who is, against all reason, a proud American, I don't like seeing my countrywomen and my culture spoken of so disparagingly. But as a personal trainer, I must point out that the first step of getting someone on the path to improvement is a harsh critical appraisal. That applies to America itself. And something that I find very interesting about American culture is how many, artists and intellectuals in the past have noticed this. In fact, if you will notice, so many, I would argue the majority of American cultural heroes fought the schoolmarm. A good many of America's cultural heroes are men specifically standing against the soft tyranny of women in authority. This trend has existed since the country's inception, but it only really became noticeable in America's high point as a nation, which is to say from 1920 to about 1980. Thus, when you strike against a womanly tyranny, you are the latest in a long chain of masculine American men doing their duty against stuffy human resources broads. We can go down the list of American cultural heroes that have struck back against womanhood, and while this is by no means an exhaustive list, in the 19th century we have, of course, Mark Twain. Remind me, who was it that filled Huckleberry Finn's head with the notion of civilization, that he would go to hell if he didn't return an escaped slave to its owner? His school teachers and other, mostly female authority figures. And in the end, what does young Huck do? He turns his back on civilization and goes into the wild frontier, where his thumos can be free and wild. And I quote, "But I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally says she's gonna adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand that. I've been there before." Of course, this is probably a reflection of the greater trend in America to make outlaws and loners the heroes, see Last of the Mohicans. But one could argue that that also represents the anti-schoolmarm conflict, if schoolmarm can be taken to symbolize civilization on the whole. And what of light periodicals and satire? Harold Ross and James Thurber, in describing their New Yorker as being not for old ladies in Dubbock, would seem to be guys rebelling against endless schoolmarming as well. Look at the way Thurber portrays wives and mothers-in-law in his work, whether it be in his seminal The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, or in his comic strips featuring gigantic shrews domineering over their downtrodden husbands. For that matter, look at how society's views have changed so much in making the 2013 adaptation of Walter Mitty. There isn't even a wife at all. And of course, I should point out that The New Yorker staffed many prominent American female intellectuals, writers, and artists in its history. So Ross and Thurber, much like myself, recognize the difference between these domineering, shrewish women and women who have their heads on straight. Classic comedy films also notice this. How many Marx Brothers or Three Stooges films involve the boys going up against Margaret Dumont, Simona Boniface, or some other burly battle axe of a grand dame representing polite society?
Will you marry me? Did he leave you any money? Answer the second question first.
He left me his entire fortune.
Is that so? Can't you see what I'm trying to tell you? I love you.
And of course, that most quintessential of American genres, besides the Western that is, the film noir, and for that matter, the source material, which is to say the pulp novels of Raymond Chandler, Mickey Spillane, and Dashiell Hammett. They are rife with scheming and villainous villainesses. For is there a more unique female villain in America than the femme fatale? For what was that character, if not a reaction to the evils that women do, or at least are perceived as doing? Hypersexualized and harsh, feigning helplessness and purity, but always wrapping the hero Patsy around her little finger and never letting loose the reins of control. Couldn't one argue that this is a bit of a schoolmarm as well? A sexy schoolmarm to be sure, but a schoolmarm nonetheless. And of course she has to be sexy for the plot to exist, because this woman's not going to seduce Sam Spade. It's worth pointing out that most of these examples came immediately after World War I in what has been conceived by many to be a backlash against prohibition and women's suffrage. And as I mentioned previously, those two things go hand in hand. I will repeat that women did have legitimate reasons for the temperance crusade, but men across the nation didn't take to having their local suddenly stripped from them very well. To say nothing of how American alcohol became a laughingstock after prohibition that has only very recently begun to be respected. It's hardly an illogical leap to see women and effeminate mollycoddled preachers working together to send American boys overseas to fight and then passing prohibition behind their backs. Now, whether or not this is actually accurate is beyond this video. That's merely the perception that undoubtedly many American men had. Note that there really aren't any great villainesses at all nowadays in film, because so few men notice the Schoolmarm phenomenon, there are even less of them to fight against it. Certainly not anybody making blockbuster movies, which is representative of the omnipresence of the feminist narrative. Well, that and the fact that most movies nowadays are made for adolescent boys who have no experience with women and not mature men like the film noirs were back in the day. So you see, I'm not the only one who recognizes the damage that busybody schoolmarms have done to America. Other, much smarter men than me have seen that too, and have made art accordingly. The only question is, why? Why have a small but influential minority of American women always been nasty, ball-breaking harridans? Now that question is going to require a lot more research in its own video someday. I'm Larson Halleck, and to borrow the sign-off catchphrase of the wonderful Film Noir archives that Razorfist does, don't get captured. And now, a word from our sponsors. Hello, are you a fan of Larson Halleck and the Barbaric Gentleman? Of course you are, otherwise you wouldn't be watching. Would you like to help the channel grow? Would you like to help me out? If so, here's how you can. You can go to patreon.com/LarsonHalleck and join the ranks of these illustrious heroes. You can also go to www.paypal.me/LarsonHalleck to also donate some money. You can also buy my book. The Patreon, the PayPal, and the link to my book are all found in the video description. You can also follow me on Twitter or on Instagram. I no longer advertise my Gab because Gab sucks. Otherwise, enjoy, keep watching the videos, and spread the word.